He rolled himself to the altar in a village where whispers carried more weight than prayers. The woman he loved stood there in traditional kente cloth, surrounded by 200 guests who came to witness a promise. But when the elder asked if she would take him as her husband, she looked at his wheelchair, then at the crowd, and said 4 words that would shake an entire community. What happened next, nobody saw coming, and by the time the sun set that evening, 7 families would never be the same again. Stay with me, because this story from a small town in West Africa will make you question everything you think you know about love, shame, and the price of speaking truth when everyone is watching. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is a story that needs to be told, and I need you here for every moment of it. His name was Marcus, though in his village they called him by his family name, Osei. He was 32 years old when this story begins, and he had been using a wheelchair for exactly 7 years. It happened on a Tuesday evening during the rainy season when he was 25, riding his motorcycle back from the timber yard where he worked as a supervisor. The road was slick with red mud, and a truck carrying plantain bundles lost control on the curve near the river. Marcus swerved to avoid it. His bike skidded sideways, and he woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed in the capital city, unable to feel his legs. The doctors used words like spinal compression and nerve damage and permanent, but Marcus heard only silence, the kind that fills your ears when your entire future dissolves in a single moment. His mother wept for weeks, his father barely spoke, and his younger brothers looked at him with eyes full of questions they didn't know how to ask. In their community, disability was often seen as punishment, a curse from ancestors, evidence of hidden sin, or in the kindest interpretation, simply bad fate that marked you as less than whole. People whispered about what he must have done to deserve this, about which family member had angered the spirits, about whether his bloodline was now tainted. Marcus heard the whispers even when no one spoke directly to him. He saw the pity in the eyes of neighbors who used to greet him with respect, and he felt the weight of being a burden in a place where strength was measured by what you could carry on your back or how many acres you could farm in a day. But Marcus refused to disappear. He refused to become the invisible man in the corner that many people with disabilities were expected to become in his village. 6 months after the accident, he returned home from the rehabilitation center in the city with a wheelchair that squeaked when it rolled over uneven ground and arms that had grown strong from pushing himself up ramps and over thresholds that were never built with him in mind. He couldn't return to the timber yard. The terrain was too rough, the pathways too narrow, the assumptions too fixed. But he didn't let that stop him. He started a small business repairing radios and mobile phones from a wooden table in front of his family's compound. He was good with his hands, always had been, and word spread slowly that Osei could fix things other people threw away. Farmers brought him their old radios, women brought him phones with cracked screens, children brought him toys that had stopped working, and Marcus fixed them all with patience and precision, charging prices that were fair and sometimes charging nothing at all when he knew a family was struggling. He didn't want pity, he wanted respect, and he earned it one repaired device at a time. That's when he met Amma. She was 26, a school teacher at the primary school 2 villages over, and she came to his table one Saturday morning with a phone that wouldn't charge and a smile that was cautious but genuine. She didn't stare at the wheelchair, didn't ask intrusive questions, didn't treat him like he was fragile or foolish or somehow less than human. She simply asked if he could fix her phone and how much it would cost. And when he told her he'd have it ready in 3 days, she thanked him and walked away without the theatrical pity he'd grown accustomed to. 3 days later, she returned, paid him, and lingered for a few extra minutes to ask where he had learned his skills. They talked about the rehabilitation center, about the trainers who taught him to see his life as changed but not over, about the small business course he took while he was there, and about her students who reminded her every day why hope mattered. She came back the following week with a radio that didn't need fixing, just cleaning, and they talked for an hour about music, about the old high life songs their parents used to play, about the new gospel tracks that filled the churches every Sunday. She came back again 2 weeks later with nothing broken at all, just a question about whether he knew where she could buy a particular phone charger, and Marcus told her honestly that she didn't need to invent excuses to talk to him. If she wanted to visit, she could just visit. Amma laughed, a real laugh that wasn't performative or nervous, and said she'd come back on Thursday with groundnuts to share. She kept her word. Thursday became their day. She would finish teaching at noon, walk the 40 minutes between her village and his, and sit at his table while he worked, talking about everything and nothing, students who made her proud, students who worried her, the politics of the school board, the rising cost of rice, the way the Hamatan wind made her skin dry, the dreams she still held close even though she was approaching 30 and still unmarried in a culture that measured a woman's worth by her husband and children. Marcos listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. He didn't pretend to have all the answers, didn't try to fix her problems the way he fixed radios, just offered perspective and presence, and somehow that was enough. 6 months passed like that, then a year, and somewhere in the accumulation of Thursdays and shared laughter and quiet moments when words weren't necessary, they both realized they had fallen in love. Marcos was terrified to say it out loud, terrified that naming it would break the fragile magic of what they had built, terrified that she would wake up one day and see him the way the rest of the village saw him, as a man diminished, a man incomplete, a man whose body had betrayed him and would betray any woman foolish enough to tie her future to his. But Amma said it first. She said it on a Thursday in the dry season when the sun was setting and the sky was streaked with orange and purple, and she said it simply, without drama or hesitation. I love you, Marcos. I see you. Not the chair, not the accident, not what you've lost. I see who you are and I love that man. Do you love me too? Marcos couldn't speak for a long moment because his throat was tight and his eyes were burning, and he couldn't believe that someone like her, someone whole and beautiful and unburdened, could look at someone like him and choose to stay. But he found his voice eventually and he told her, yes, he loved her, he had loved her for months, and he didn't know what he'd done to deserve her, but he was grateful every single day. They decided to marry. It wasn't an impulsive decision. They talked about it seriously, carefully, weighing all the challenges they would face. They talked about accessibility, about the fact that most homes in the village had steps and narrow doorways and no ramps, about the physical realities of marriage and intimacy, which Marcos approached with honesty and Amma received without flinching. They talked about children, about whether they wanted them and whether it was possible. And Marcos shared what the doctors had told him, that his injury didn't affect his ability to father children. And Amma said that whether they had children or not, she wanted a life with him. They talked about money, about how they would support themselves, and Amma said her salary was steady and his business was growing, and together they would be fine. They talked about the stigma, about the gossip, about the way people would judge them, and Amma said she'd spent her whole life trying to meet other people's expectations and she was tired of performing for an audience that would criticize her no matter what she did. They went to Amma's father first, as tradition required, and Marcos brought his own father and 2 uncles with him for the formal visit. Amma's father was a retired civil servant, a man known for his sternness and his high standards, and Marcos had prepared himself for rejection. But Amma's father surprised him. He asked Marcos questions about his business, his plans, his understanding of what marriage required, his health, his faith, and Marcos answered every question with honesty and humility. At the end of the conversation, Amma's father was quiet for a long time. Then he said this, I won't pretend I'm not concerned. I won't pretend this is what I pictured for my daughter. But I've watched her these past months, and I've never seen her happier. She's a grown woman, she knows her mind, and if you are the man she's chosen, then I will not stand in her way. I will support this marriage, and I will make sure my family does the same. Marcos exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, and when he thanked Amma's father, his voice cracked with emotion. The formal negotiations began after that, discussions about bride price, about the items that would be presented, about the date and the location and the rituals that would be observed. Marcos couldn't afford an extravagant ceremony, but he saved every sadie he could spare, and his family contributed what they could manage. They set the date for a Saturday in October, after the harvest, when people would have time to attend and the weather would be cooler. Word spread through both villages that Amma, the teacher, was marrying Osai, the phone repairman, the one in the wheelchair, and the reactions were mixed. Some people were supportive, calling it love that transcended circumstances, calling Amma brave, calling Marcos blessed. But others were harsh. They called Amma foolish, naive, throwing her life away on a man who couldn't provide for her properly, who would be a burden rather than a partner. They said she'd regret it within a year, that she was too educated to be pushing a wheelchair for the rest of her life, that she could do better. Some of the older women in Amma's family pulled her aside and questioned her decision privately, asking if she understood what she was getting into, asking if she'd thought about the shame of being tied to a disabled man, asking if there was, perhaps, some hidden reason she felt compelled to marry him. Amma stood firm every single time. She told them she knew exactly what she was doing, that Marcus was a good man, that she loved him, and that their opinions, while noted, would not change her mind. Marcus heard the gossip too, heard the doubts, heard the cruel jokes about whether the marriage would even be consummated, heard the speculation about whether Amma was marrying him out of pity or out of some misguided sense of charity. It hurt deeply, but he didn't let it break him. He focused on the wedding, on preparing himself, on making sure everything he could control was done right. But there was one group Marcus didn't account for: Amma's friends, her bridesmaids, 3 women she'd known since secondary school who thought they had her best interest at heart but who couldn't see past their own biases and fears. They didn't openly oppose the marriage, but they planted seeds of doubt. Over the weeks leading up to the wedding, they made comments that sounded like concern but felt like poison. They asked Amma if she was sure, if she'd really thought it through, if she understood that her life would be harder than it needed to be. They reminded her of men who'd been interested in her before, men who were whole, men who could give her an easier life. They joked about how she'd have to do all the heavy lifting in the marriage, literally and figuratively, and though they laughed when they said it, the message was clear. They made her watch videos of couples dancing at weddings and asked, gently, cruelly, how she thought her wedding photos would look, whether she was okay with the optics, whether she worried people would pity her instead of celebrating with her. Amma defended Marcus every time, but the constant drip of doubt began to wear on her. She didn't tell Marcus about these conversations, didn't want to burden him, didn't want him to feel responsible for her friend's small-mindedness, but she carried the weight of their words into the days before the wedding, and that weight grew heavier than she expected. The wedding day arrived on a Saturday morning that was bright and hot, the kind of day where the sun seemed to press down on everything and everyone moved a little slower than usual. The ceremony was held at the village community center, a large open hall with a concrete floor and wooden benches arranged in rows. Marcus arrived early with his family, his chair freshly cleaned, his suit borrowed from his cousin but tailored to fit him perfectly. He wore a traditional Kente stole over his shoulders, the colors vibrant against the dark fabric of his suit, and though his hands were shaking slightly, his face was calm. He had practiced getting from his chair to a slightly elevated seat at the front where he and Amma would sit during the ceremony, had made sure the route was smooth, had anticipated every detail. His brothers helped him position himself, and he waited, surrounded by 200 guests, some genuinely happy for him, some curiosity seekers, some skeptics waiting to see if this unlikely union would actually happen. The musicians began to play traditional drumming, the kind that's made your chest vibrate, and the guests stood as Amma entered. She was breathtaking. She wore a deep blue kaba and slit with gold embroidery that caught the light as she moved. Her head wrap was tall and elegant, and her face was radiant. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes because he couldn't believe this woman, this brilliant, beautiful, strong woman, had chosen him. She walked slowly down the aisle, flanked by her bridesmaids, and for a moment everything felt perfect, felt like a dream he'd been too afraid to have. But as Amma reached the front and stood beside him, Marcus noticed something. Her hands were trembling, more than nerves should account for. Her smile was tight, forced. Her eyes flickered toward her friends, toward the crowd, toward the doorway, as if calculating an escape route. The elder who was officiating the ceremony, a respected man in his 70s who had known both families for decades, began the traditional rituals. He spoke about the joining of 2 families, about the responsibilities of marriage, about the blessing of ancestors. He poured libations, calling on those who had gone before to guide and protect this union. He asked Marcus if he was ready to take Amma as his wife, to honor her, to provide for her, to remain faithful to her, and Marcus said yes, his voice strong and clear despite the knot in his stomach. Then the elder turned to Amma. He asked her the same questions, the words familiar, the rhythm ancient, and the room fell silent, waiting for her response. Amma looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and for a long moment she said nothing. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, unbearable. Marcus saw something cross her face, fear, shame, doubt. He couldn't tell which, and then she glanced at her bridesmaids who were standing behind her, and one of them, the loudest one, the one who'd made the most cutting comments during the weeks leading up to the wedding, gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. That gesture, small as it was, sealed what happened next. Amma opened her mouth and said, "I can't do this." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The drumming stopped mid-beat. Marcos felt the floor tilt beneath him, felt his entire body go cold. Amma's voice shook as she continued, and what she said next would haunt him for months. She said, "I thought I could. I thought love was enough, but I keep thinking about what my life would be like. Always having to help, always having to be the strong one, always having to explain, always having to defend." She gestured toward Marcus without looking at him directly, and her voice broke. "I don't want to spend my life taking care of someone. I want a partner, not a patient. I want a normal marriage. I want what everyone else has. I'm sorry, I can't." Some of the guests looked horrified, some looked uncomfortable, and a few, shockingly, looked relieved, like they'd been expecting this all along. Amma's bridesmaids moved closer to her, surrounding her, protective, and one of them said something low and comforting that Marcus couldn't hear. He sat there, frozen, unable to process what was happening, unable to speak, unable to even feel the humiliation fully because his mind had shut down in self-defense. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, someone laughed. It was quick, awkward, the kind of nervous laugh that escapes when tension is too high, but it was there, audible, cruel in its timing. Amma flinched at the sound, and Marcus finally found his voice. He didn't yell, didn't rage, didn't beg. He simply said, quietly, so only the people closest to him could hear, "Is this really what you want? To do this here in front of everyone, to reduce me to this?" Amma's face crumpled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. But she nodded. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry." And then she turned and walked back down the aisle, her bridesmaids trailing behind her, like a protective formation, and the guests parted to let her through. The community center was silent except for the sound of her heels on the concrete floor and the rustle of her dress as she disappeared through the doorway. Marcus sat there for a moment that felt like an hour, his mind blank, his body numb. Then he looked at the elder, who was staring at him with a mixture of pity and helplessness, and said, "Can we dismiss the guests?" The elder nodded, cleared his throat, and addressed the crowd. He said that the ceremony would not continue, that the families asked for privacy, that everyone should please return to their homes. People began to leave, slowly at first, then in a rush, murmuring to each other, some casting glances back at Marcus, some shaking their heads, some already pulling out their phones to spread the news. Within an hour, the story would be all over both villages and the neighboring towns. The teacher who left the disabled man at the altar, the man in the wheelchair who thought he could have a normal marriage, the wedding that became a spectacle, the shame that would follow both of them for years. But Marcos didn't think about any of that in the moment. He thought about the months of Thursdays, the conversations, the laughter, the promises. He thought about how Amma had said she saw him, really saw him. And he realized now that maybe she had seen him, but she had also seen the chair, the limitations, the judgments of others. And in the end, those things had been louder than love. His brothers came to him, helped him back into his chair, and began to wheel him toward the door. But Marcos stopped them. He said, "Wait, give me a minute." And they stepped back, confused. Marcos sat there in the empty hall, surrounded by abandoned decorations and half-empty benches, and he made a decision. He called to the elder, who was packing up the ceremonial items, and asked him for one more favor. He asked if the elder would gather the core families, his parents, his brothers, Amma's father if he was willing, and a few of the community leaders who were still lingering outside. The elder agreed, sensing that Marcos had something important to say. 20 minutes later, about 15 people were seated in the front rows of the hall. Marcos positioned himself in front of them, his chest steady, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't look broken, he looked resolute. He spoke clearly, without bitterness, though his voice carried the weight of deep pain. He said this, "I want to say something before we all leave here and before the gossip becomes the only version of today that people remember. What happened here was not just about me and Amma. It was about something bigger. It was about how we treat people who are different, how we make them feel like they are less, how we plant seeds of doubt in the people who love them, until those people can't see past the fear anymore." Amma didn't wake up this morning wanting to hurt me. She woke up terrified, terrified of judgment, terrified of hardship, terrified of a life that doesn't look like what everyone told her it should look like. And I don't blame her for that fear because I've lived with it every single day since my accident. I've heard the whispers, I've seen the pity, I've felt the way people look at me and decide I'm not whole, not worthy, not enough. What I blame is the culture that taught her that fear, the friends who fed it, the community that made her think she had to choose between love and a so-called normal life. I'm not angry at Amma, I'm heartbroken, but I understand. What I don't understand is why we do this to each other, why we make people with disabilities prove their worth over and over again, why we treat accessibility and inclusion like burdens instead of basic decency, why we let fear and stigma destroy something beautiful. The room was silent, people shifted uncomfortably, a few looked ashamed, and Marcus continued. He said, "I don't want pity. I never wanted pity. What I wanted was a chance to live a full life, to love and be loved, to contribute to my community, to be seen as a person first and a wheelchair user second. And I've tried, I've built a business, I've helped people, I've been kind, I've worked harder than most of you can imagine just to do what you take for granted. But it wasn't enough, because in the end, the chair was all anyone could see." Amma's father, who was seated in the front row, his face tight with shame, stood up and said, "Marcus, I apologize for my daughter, for her friends, for all of us who should have done better. You are a good man, a strong man, and you deserved better than this." Marcus nodded, accepting the apology, but he wasn't finished. He said, "Here's what I want to come from today. I want us to stop treating people with disabilities like tragic figures or burdens or objects of pity. I want us to build ramps, not just physical ones, but social ones, so that people like me can participate fully in this community. I want us to teach our children that disability doesn't equal inability, that worth isn't measured by what your body can do, but by who you are as a person. And I want us to hold each other accountable when we see stigma and discrimination, even when it's subtle, even when it's wrapped in concern or tradition. I'm going to start a fund," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I'll call it the Access Fund. It will help families in our region who have members with disabilities to get the tools they need: wheelchairs, crutches, hearing aids, ramps, education, whatever helps them live with dignity. I'll seed it with the money I saved for this wedding, and I'll invite anyone who wants to contribute to join me. If today is going to be remembered, let it be remembered for that, not just for the shame." People around the room began to nod, some wiping their eyes, some looking genuinely moved. One of the community leaders, an older woman who ran the market association, stood and said, "I will contribute, and I will make sure others do too. Marcus, you've shown us something today. Grace under circumstances that would break most people. We need to learn from that." Another man, a teacher from Amma's school, said, "I'll help spread the word about the fund, and I'll make sure our students learn about inclusion and respect for people with disabilities. This is long overdue." One by one, people began to pledge support, not just money, but time, effort, commitment to changing the culture that had failed Marcus and Amma. Amma's father approached Marcus, knelt beside his chair, and said quietly, "I failed you both. I should have prepared her better, should have confronted her friends, should have been stronger. I'm sorry." Marcus placed a hand on the older man's shoulder and said, "You tried, and that means something. Let's both do better moving forward." The gathering ended with plans to reconvene in a week to formalize the Access Fund and begin identifying families who needed support. Marcus left the community center that afternoon, not as a humiliated groom, but as a man who had turned his pain into purpose. The story spread, yes, but not the way he'd feared. People talked about the wedding that didn't happen, but they also talked about Marcus's speech, about the fund, about the questions he'd raised, about the shame they felt for participating in a culture that marginalized people with disabilities. Over the following months, the Access Fund grew. Contributions came from both villages and beyond, people who heard the story and wanted to be part of the solution. Marcos used the money to help 10 families in the first year, providing wheelchairs, funding school fees for children with disabilities, building ramps at the health clinic and the community center, and organizing workshops on disability awareness. He became a quiet leader, not seeking attention but earning respect through consistent action. He never heard from Amma again. She left the village soon after the wedding, taking a teaching position in the capital city. And though Marcos sometimes wondered if she ever thought about him, he didn't let her absence define him. 2 years later, Marcos met someone else, a woman named Elsie, who ran a small catering business and who came to his repair shop to fix a blender. They talked, they laughed, they became friends, and eventually they became more. Elsie had her own story. She'd been widowed young and had 2 children to raise alone, and she didn't see Marcos's chair as a barrier, but as one part of a whole person she admired. They married quietly, a small ceremony, with close family and a few friends, and they built a life that was full of challenges, yes, but also full of joy, partnership, and mutual respect. Marcos never forgot the wedding that didn't happen, but he also didn't let it destroy him. He let it teach him, and he let it teach his community. And sometimes, late at night, when Elsie asked him if he regretted anything, he would say honestly, "I regret the pain, I regret the humiliation, but I don't regret what came after." That day broke me open, but it also broke open a conversation that needed to happen. And because of that, other people won't have to suffer the way I did. So no, I don't regret it. I just wish it hadn't been necessary. The Access Fund still operates today, now run by a board of community members and supported by local businesses and international donors. It has helped over 300 people with disabilities in the region, and it has inspired similar initiatives in neighboring areas. The community center where Marcos was left at the altar now has ramps, accessible bathrooms, and reserved seating for people with disabilities. The schools teach inclusion as part of their curriculum, and the conversations have changed, slowly, imperfectly, but meaningfully. So let me ask you this, wherever you are watching from, what would you have done if you were Marcos? Would you have walked away in silence, or would you have found the strength to turn your pain into change? And what would you have done if you were Amma? Would you have had the courage to face your fears before the wedding day? Or would the pressure of friends and culture have overwhelmed you too? These are not easy questions, and I'm not here to judge either of them too harshly, because both of them were products of a system that failed them long before they ever reached that altar. But here's what I know. Marcos chose dignity over bitterness, and that choice rippled outward in ways he could never have predicted. He didn't let one moment of rejection define his entire life. He let it refine his purpose. And that's the lesson. Pain is inevitable, especially when you live in a body or a circumstance that the world isn't built for. But what you do with that pain, that's a choice. You can let it harden you, or you can let it open you. You can let it isolate you, or you can let it connect you to others who are suffering in similar ways. Marcos chose connection, chose purpose, chose to build something that would outlast his own heartbreak. And in doing so, he didn't just change his own story, he changed the story of an entire community. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. I know it wasn't easy. If it moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you think differently about how we treat people with disabilities, then please share it. Drop a comment telling me how you felt, what you would have done, and where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because we tell stories here that matter, stories that don't get told enough, stories that have the power to change hearts and minds. I'll see you in the next one.